We're joined today by Dr. Kristopher Copeland, who is correct any titles I mispronounced, Assistant Vice President of Academic Affairs for Tulsa Community College, and it is the largest community college in our state. They have four or five campuses throughout the metro area, and so it's by far the largest student populated collegiate area in the eastern half of the state. So he gets to regularly coordinate, multitask between various departments, bodies. There's a lot of oversight, so he's heavy into administrative tasks and duties. Now we are the beneficiaries. He's on occasion, when available, moonlighted in a couple of capacities for us. You may even have seen him a time or two in a class here or there. We're really grateful that he's aiding the development of our new graduate emphasis, and he's credentialed there. So that you say to yourself, oh, how is an administrator credentialed there? And Dr. Copeland's background is in the field of communication studies. And he could elaborate on that in a few moments, but he utilized both his bachelor's and master's degree in those focal areas, including work at Arkansas University, where he finished his terminal degree, PhD. And if I'm right, that was in educational administration. Is that accurate? Or to that effect, you can recontextualize in a moment. But he's served for many years as a faculty member at NSU State College in the eastern side, both NSU Tahlequah, but also NSU has a thriving satellite campus in Broken Arrow, which is a suburb of the Tulsa area. And he also coached forensics, speech and debate for many years at NSU, and this is actually where our paths first collided. I know you all are familiar with my background as speech debate coach, and so we were able to develop a healthy professional collegial relationship over the years, and it's been a terrific. We have co-edited a book actually together on competitive speech and debate, so it was a nice feather in our cap as we essentially were each transitioning out of that particular field and into other types of duties. And so he served as a dean of the humanities, in essence, at Dallas, at North Dallas Community College, or there's something like that. And then after several years moving into that administrative role full-time, he was able to continue those services up in the Tulsa Community College area. He's a native of Oklahoman, so that's there's comfort food and coming back closer to home for him. And he's been able to grow in his administrative capacities at TCC, and I'm sure it's probably not the end of the road. We'll see what happens someday, and that's exciting. He's been an active scholar in the field. He's had several published pieces on forensics and some other things. And so if in an ideal world, I could have located and sent some of those out for you to peruse, but maybe I can put them in our shared readings folder afterward. So he's had this opportunity to toggle between different things: the scholarly world, the academic world, the administrative world, coaching, and with a firm foundation in communication studies. Here is someone that has training, the same kind of classical training in rhetoric and in persuasion that we're attempting to gain some foundational knowledge of in this class. And what's exciting is he can translate to us how those skills can become used in practical ways in professional settings throughout your career. And so that's the focal point today, is we're excited to hear about not only the work that he does, but really to put it in the context, what roles does persuasion play in the modern setting of the interrelating jobs in higher education? Dr. Copeland, welcome, and I'll I'll cede my time to the speaker.
Thank you so much, Dr. Castleberry. It is a pleasure to join you all today. Gosh, that was such a nice introduction. You remember so much about me, and I feel a little guilty because I'm like, gosh, did I do all those things? So I appreciate you teeing that up and setting that up. So as Dr. Castleberry mentioned, I come from a comm background. I was fortunate that I was recruited from high school as a speech and debate kid to continue that experience through college. I really had no clue what I was going to major in. I was a first generation college student, so I didn't really know how college worked. And so I was so fortunate that speech and debate provided an avenue for me to not only find my voice physically, but also to help me find my discipline home throughout higher ed. I fell in love with higher ed when I started as a student, and as a result, I've never left. I've been here since I started, and I know many in academia have that same story. As I worked on my graduate program, I went to the University of Arkansas, and again, I became a graduate assistant in speech and debate, doing forensics at the collegiate level and coaching. And after that, as I moved into faculty positions, I started an interdisciplinary PhD. And so the nice thing about interdisciplinary is you get a lot of variety of experiences. And I was fortunate that I could continue in a communication capacity with some of my coursework. So while my MA was heavily focused in interpersonal communication, specifically focused on like self-disclosure, my PhD, when I did get to filter in some comm courses, it was more focused on political comm because the focus of that degree was in, as Dr. Castleberry mentioned, higher education, but specifically political comm and public policy and implications of that. So I've got a vast variety of different communication perspectives. In my current role as an administrator, I'm so thankful that I had some theoretical classes on persuasion and other communication aspects because I feel like I use them every day in the role that I'm in. I think in my role in academic affairs now, I am consistently having to sway people's values, attitudes, and beliefs. And I consistently have to reinforce those attitudes, values, and beliefs. There are some that take very little convincing. They're already persuaded. And so I just have to work to reinforce that value, that attitude, and that belief. And then on the other side of the fence, you've got people that are very skeptical, and I have to really think through how I'm going to persuade them to join a specific cause or to understand a viewpoint of a policy that we're going to institute at the college. So I'm going to talk through a couple of things that I think I have applied from persuasive theory, and then we'll open it up for discussion and see what sort of questions that you all might have for me as well. First of all, I was so fortunate that I had an undergraduate course in persuasion, like what you're sitting in now. And then in graduate school, when I went the interpersonal track, I had a graduate seminar on persuasion as well. It reinforced a lot of the concepts that I was introduced to as an undergrad, but we took some deep dives into like the elaboration likelihood model, social judgment theory. And I think that those types of theoretical frameworks still inform my communication plans now as I'm thinking about how to gain buy-in and build relationships with others in order for them and in order to bring them along as we're introducing new initiatives, plans, and policies at the college. So a couple of things that I want to dive into. First of all, it's been really important that I apply some of the skills related to swaying attitudes. And I think a lot of it, when I think about attitudes for those that I work with, so I'm dealing with a lot of faculty members. We have 400 faculty members at our college. Those faculty members report to one of 7 academic deans, and those deans then report to me. So I'm dealing with about 400 people that are managed through my line of leadership, right? So people come in with some predisposed attitudes about a variety of topics related to teaching and learning, right? So I want to give an example of during the pandemic when in 2020, right after spring break, like the majority of colleges in the US, we switched to being completely virtual, right? Those were some really hard times when I look back at it, right? There were many that could not, it wasn't even fathomable that we would do something like that, right? And I think that's an example of where we had mixed attitudes on the topic. We had some that were very cautious, that felt like we didn't close down soon enough. And then we had others that were so skeptical in their attitude. They were like, I don't know what the big deal is. Why are we doing this, right? And so that took some very authoritarian leadership style where we made decisions. We gathered very little input, basing decisions based on national data, on state government data, and then ultimately the executive order from the governor of the state, right, saying that we need to shelter in place, right? So thinking about some of those attitude changes with online learning, what we learned, we had 400 full-time faculty. The majority of them had some type of entry-level or advanced training on developing online courses. Then we have about 600 to 700 adjuncts. And at the time, I think we had less than 100 that had any sort of online training with us as an institution, because we had really reserved online courses as a privilege for full-time faculty. So we had to quickly think about how are we going to train all of these faculty members, 600 plus faculty members, to teach online, right? So we had some pretty hard attitude changes that we had to address quickly, right? Again, I go back to the interpersonal side of persuasion and how important it is to think about the relationships you build, the trust that you build with others. So in order to do some of that attitudinal shifting that's needed in persuasion, it came with ensuring we had the right faculty in the room to discuss what type of support do these faculty members need that have never taught an online course for us. What type of training can we quickly stand up for faculty so that they have the tools that they need to be effective in the online environment with students? We created, and this was not very popular, but we created an online peer review process. So what we did is we matched up every faculty member, full-time and part-time, matched them up with someone at the college. We gave each other access to their learning management system. We used D2L, right, at MacU. So it'd be giving everybody access to that and providing support from a colleague to say, hey, how does your instructional design look? What are some tips that you might provide? What are some areas for growth in the next iteration of this course, right? And so through that, it took a while, but especially as we moved into summer, and we made the decision to continue throughout the summer fully online. I think we eventually changed a majority of those attitudes that were nervous to make that online shift. The second skill I want to talk about relates to like our values. And when I think of values, I think of sort of that usefulness, that perception of usefulness. And I think about just the role of higher education. I mean, it has really been under attack in some of the culture wars that have happened nationally about the value of higher education, potential indoctrination that happens through the educational process, right? And so I'm constantly reminded in my role of having to promote the value of higher education. So one way that I've had to do that is I meet with a variety of employers in the Tulsa area through my job. So sometimes it's multiple times in a week, sometimes it's just a few times in a month. And then there are some months that I may not go by and have much interaction at all. It kind of ebbs and flows. We have about 16 workforce programs at our institution. So we have advisory boards that is composed mainly of our employers in the city, right? And I sit on each of those advisory committees. So, and they meet twice a year. So I feel like I'm in pretty good communication with those individuals. It's interesting in those conversations because they need skilled employees that have gained higher education credentials. They totally get the value of higher education and they are not skeptical at all. However, in conversations, they often will refer to this cliff that is coming in enrollment and the scarcity of what it could look like in their areas if we don't continue to show the value of higher education and its impact on the workforce in Oklahoma, and specifically in our region of Northeast Oklahoma. So I feel like that gives me then the opportunity when I am out and about meeting with other constituents outside of that workforce group to talk about, hey, I was just in an advisory committee with the veterinarian technology program, and here's what they're saying that they need their registered vet techs to know, and this is what we provide as an institution, right? So I feel like I constantly have the opportunity to influence that perception of value and usefulness from a higher ed standpoint. And a part of that is getting to know those employers really well and what they value, and then making sure that we deliver upon the product that they need. And then the third thing I want to talk about is just how to change behavior through persuasion, which again is a direct application of persuasive theory. And that can be really challenging to change behavior, especially if people are predisposed in an opposite stance of you. I think a really good example from my vantage point in education is just the enrollment process. So we have roughly 13,000 students that enroll at our institution each semester. When you combine both fall and summer, we're serving about 20,000 different students over both semesters. What we have found is that 20% of our enrollment comes in the last 2 weeks before a semester starts, right? So that means it's a really heavy lift for our advisors, for our enrollment service center, for the admissions program, to get those students registered, their applications complete, all their documents complete, and get them into classes at the institution. We've worked really hard to persuade and influence that behavior to where we get them enrolled sooner. And I think we've seen some bright spots with that. So for instance, we've started doing what we call pop-up events where we take our show on the road, and we will show up at local libraries. We'll show up at, we showed up at some different events here in Tulsa. We have an expo center that does a big workforce fair. And so we've showed up at that, and it's all hands on deck, and we help enroll students on site at those events, right? We've also worked really hard with our dual credit students, those students that are in high school. Many of them won't enroll until the week before classes start because they're used to showing up that first week of that week before school and getting a schedule, right? So we've worked really hard to educate and to help those students get enrolled before that cycle begins, like way earlier in the process. So it's about changing that behavior to help our enrollment. We have seen that big rush those last 2 weeks is not as bottlenecked as it used to be because of some of those efforts. Comes with a whole lot of communication and intentionality, though. So those are some of the things that I thought I could share from my perspective about attitudes, values, and beliefs that I feel like I have some influence over in my role at the institution. I know it's almost 11:30, so we don't have a lot of time left, but I thought we could open it up for some questions that you all might have about this conversation or topics that you've heard that interest you.
Absolutely. Well, I openly encourage us to be thinking of those if you don't already have one loaded. Do so, but let me kind of kick us off, and then we'll create some awkward silence in a little bit if we don't have anything by that point. I had a question. You mentioned when you're talking about first generation, well, you're talking about policies and policy making. And you used COVID as an example of needing to rapidly train faculty in a completely different orientation, and also against the willingness of some. What other kinds of policy might you be involved in? And then with whom do you have to coordinate to do those things, to move something forward?
Great question. So I think there are a variety of different audiences. So I oversee our director of dual credit, which is the high school program that we have for students to earn college credit. When I say I influence policy in that sense, I get a seat at the state table. So our state regents that craft policy for all of the higher ed institutions across the state. I've been invited to be in a work group with them for the last 3 years. It started in COVID and it still continues today, about dual credit policies and about higher ed and the implications then on all the higher ed institutions across the state. So for instance, we moved from having a pilot of what's called an early college high school program. And I was fortunate enough to be able to be in discussions with high-level policymakers with the state regents to craft a policy that is now instituted statewide, and that we see multiple colleges adopting early college programs, where I was able to help inform the policy that guides their programs. Their programs now at Oklahoma City Community College, at Connors State College in Muskogee. I think there's a program out at Panhandle State University as well. So there are multiple programs now that follow these guidelines that I got a front seat to helping craft at the state level. So that's exciting. Also at a local level, I would say I'm in constant conversations with our high school partners. So Tulsa Public School is one of the largest public school districts in the state. So I'm in constant contact with their superintendent and their leadership team. Broken Arrow, which has the largest high school in the state, their superintendent, I'm often in conversations with them. And then we serve, I think, about 117 different school districts, because we also have an online virtual dual credit program that services the whole state, right? So I'm not as close with all of those different partners, but because I work so closely with TPS, Broken Arrow, Union, Jinx, Bixby, I'm able to help us as an institution think about our MOUs, our memorandums of understanding that we craft, which is basically the policy that guides the type of courses we'll offer, the type of support we're going to offer those high school students in those courses, the type of schedule we're going to provide, locations, time, days when those courses are offered. So I get to craft that policy that then we adapt to the other 100 partners that I may not work as closely with because my director is working closely with them, but we use that as our guide then to craft policy that those other school districts will follow as they're taking or sending students to us to take dual credit courses. So that's two examples, one really globally at a state level and then locally. And then I would say in my seat, I get to be pretty influential in the policies that we institute that impact students in academic affairs. So for instance, in 2021, the state regents for higher education, because of the pandemic, sort of accelerated a test optional application process for institutions. OU was doing that for a while. They were testing it out. OSU joined that. So then the state regents always required us to have some sort of ACT or SAT or AccuPlacer type testing, right? So my boss is the chief academic officer. She and I had several discussions about, do we want to join this pilot with the state regents and allow our students to also come in with unweighted GPA as a source to help place students, rather than saying you are required to take an ACT in addition to your unweighted high school GPA. So that impacts globally all of the students that come to TCC, right? Because now what we're saying is, if you've got a 3.2 GPA, you do not have to have any additional testing in order to be reading proficient and proficient in math. So those are some pretty huge implications that, you know, I get a front row seat at and have an opportunity to communicate different points of view and influence along the way.
Questions from our audience? You mentioned the pandemic case study of needing to quickly expedite new processes, online learning for a lot of mostly on ground traditional faculty. How do you convincingly persuade buy-in? What kinds of tactics go into you and it was an emergency situation, you name dropped authoritarian leadership techniques, and that arguably there's a warranty case for that. But are there other types of maybe persuasive techniques that you're taking in smaller meetings or with smaller groups, right? Mm-hmm. How do you distinguish between when to be what type of form of persuasive to a state?
Good question. So you will often hear in a higher education setting the term shared governance, which is more of a democratic way of leadership to say, how are you ensuring that you've got a variety of stakeholder voices involved in the decision-making process, right? So I would say shared governance is definitely the direction that one would want to go when making decisions in higher ed that will impact a large group of people. In the pandemic, to your point, Dr. Castleberry, it was a very different situation. And we had to make some decisions that were very top-down heavy, given the circumstances that we were in. However, I will say, even though we were making those decisions, we have a faculty association group at our institution. So we would often make the decision, and then we would bring in the president of FA and let them know, hey, here's the decision we're making. Here are the reasons why we have to make this decision. Before we announce this, what are some things that need to be considered as in either the discussion points, or our CAO at the time was pretty firm. She's like, I'm not going to change my mind on this, but is there something that I've not thought about that we need to be thinking differently about, right? So I appreciated that she invited the FA president, and we actually have a structure where we have four. You have a past president, the president, a vice president, and then a president-elect. So there are four, what we refer to as sort of that FA leadership. So if my mind serves me right, I don't know that just the president came in. I think probably all four of those were in the room, in the virtual room at the time where all that went down and where that happened. I also think that people were extremely unaware of where the pandemic was headed. I remember we were talking about, it was like, this may be 2 weeks, a month, right? We had no clue it was going to be, our institution was going to be shut down for 5 months and everything was going to be virtual for those 5 months, right? So I think because of the unknown, I think it was easier for us to take that authoritarian approach to say, hey, we've made some decisions based on the data and the info as we know of it today, right? Tell us, now that you hear this for the first time, before we announce this to the entire college body, what are concerns that we need to be sure that we're ready to address? And I think that's really helpful too, just to know what would you expect to hear from, what could be some of the pain points, the grumbling that might happen, so you're ready to respond to it and you're not caught off guard, so that you don't have a response. I think outside of that, I think it's really important to take the step back and engage in shared governance where you have multiple voices. So at our institution, we have what we refer to as a council structure. So our president has 5 direct reports. Each of those direct reports manages a council. So we have our chief academic officer, she has an academic affairs council. Our chief student affairs officer has a student affairs council. And so that's basically the council structure, right? The council structure is where we allow that shared governance. So after we got through the initial online portion of the pandemic, we instituted that online peer review that I mentioned earlier, right? Very authoritatively. Everybody's going to have someone enrolled in your class with you. They're going to provide guidance and feedback on your course, right? Then about a year's time later, we had a task force of faculty and administrators look at that specific online peer review process, offer suggestions for improvement, and then they presented it to the council. And then the council is made up of our 7 school deans and a faculty member from each one of those schools. So 14 faculty and deans that have what we refer to as a voting privilege. They get to vote on behalf of their school, right? So then it was presented as a proposal of, here's what happened during the pandemic. Here's what we feel like we glean from the online peer review process that works well for us as an institution, but here are some things that we need to adjust and not do moving forward, right? And then as a council, we voted on that. And I will say, while there was a lot of unhappiness about instituting that blanket peer review on everyone, I think going back to the council process and acknowledging that we did that in an emergency situation, and there was openness to make adjustments to it, went a really long way with getting that buy-in that you need from faculty to not only help boost morale, but to also see how they can add a voice and they can influence and implement and persuasively make change at the institution as well.
You drew a distinction for us between, you had some exposure as an undergrad, you did deepen that in grad school, and possibly some of it folded into a matured understanding of persuasion. But the average student might not have grad school aspirations, and yet we've spent some decent time studying kind of classical formations of rhetoric and some of these older ideas and figures in history of persuasion. What's a way in which we can keep our skill sets sharpened, or maybe continue to draw a deeper knowledge about persuasion as we kind of leave the university system, right? Or do we have to stay plugged into academia forever?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it is so essential to have your metaphorical tool belt on, right? And I think that's what I learned as an undergrad through all of my coursework, is that those courses in interpersonal and persuasion and family were really giving me tools in that, and how I can be successful communicating to others, right? So when I think about even what you are speaking to, Dr. Castleberry, about thinking about rhetoric and rhetoricians, I to this day will see a commercial on TV, and I will think back to a persuasion class where we did a unit on media and the persuasive arguments and tactics that happen through media and persuasion, right? And I may not remember the exact theory we were talking about that day, but I'll hear that and I'll be like, huh, that's interesting. Or I'll think back to that class in some ways. And I think about how perhaps an organization or a product placement or something is using a persuasive tool from the tool belt to persuade a mass audience to buy into a product or to change their attitude or value about something in particular. I was reading just this morning, I was reading sort of a news brief on a state senator from Oklahoma who had sort of, I guess, fought back with in a congressional meeting with someone from a union, right? And they were talking specifically about pay. And as I was reading through it, now I'm reminded of the persuasive tactics that were used on both sides, some leaving out information, others acknowledging information that was misconstrued, right? And I thought, wow, and now I think back to it and think about the persuasive tactics that are being used in those conversations, right? So I think it's important that students just think about how we're consumers of this information, and that because we've had this exposure to persuasion theory, classical rhetoric, that it should make us better consumers of information as we complete our college careers and we move into the workforce with our family. I have a brother-in-law that it's really, I just can't stand to be around him anymore because he only sees things through his lens, and he's not open to hearing other perspectives, right? And I think he's really short-sighted in that at times, right? So again, I think it comes back to, rather than me just being angry about it, I also think now back to some of the tools that I have in my belt about communication, right? And thinking about his avoidance. When I think about cognitive dissonance, I think he avoids perspectives that are different than his because he cannot stand cognitive dissonance. Like, he does not want those competing attitudes in his mind, right? So I just think it's helpful to know that those types of things, to understand the world around us and to make us smart consumers of the information that we take in.
Your response reminded me again of this course has kind of in some ways been a mirror, been a companion to a class we held last semester, digital media literacy, and in it we practiced some disciplined forms of gaining greater insight, and specifically we would play a monthly game that we called fallacies and biases, where we were practicing the due diligence in terms of learning to identify, define, and understand various cognitive biases we possess, their names, but also the logical fallacies that we commit. And we can't avoid all of them, but the point is to have a literacy, a dexterity, an ability to, an awareness, right? And awareness is a key cog in the machine to being able to then make more determinate choices about the kinds of persuasion we're either making or encountering in the world. Well, with that being said, Dr. Copeland, thank you so much for your time. We're going to right at time here for what we arranged and agreed upon, and I just want to give you that chance to to break away. And we appreciate you joining us, talking about your experiences and giving us some insights, right? For perhaps some of these undetermined minds. If people are still processing, hey, what does the next 2 years look like, let alone 5, let alone 10 years? And it's great to hear from diversity of voices for how we could maybe use some of these skill sets regardless of the direction we follow.
Great. Well, I appreciate the time today, and Dr. Castleberry has my contact information. So if anyone has any follow-up questions, you'd like to have a conversation, pick my brain about something, please feel free to reach out.